In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union looked unstoppable. From the outside, it appeared to be a machine built for permanence, a superpower stretching across 11 time zones. A nation that had crushed Nazi Germany, built nuclear parity with the United States, launched the first satellite into space, and sent the first human into orbit. Its military stood face to face with NATO across Europe, tanks lined up from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Its red flag flew over half the globe through allies, proxies, and revolutions. Western intelligence agencies feared it. Western politicians warned their populations about it. Western newspapers wrote endlessly about its industrial might. And inside the Soviet Union, the message was even clearer. This system was eternal. From childhood, Soviet citizens were taught that history itself had chosen their country to lead humanity forward. Capitalism was portrayed as unstable, exploitative, doomed to collapse under its own contradictions. Socialism, by contrast, was scientific, rational, planned. It would eliminate chaos and inequality. It would outproduce the West, outlast it, and eventually replace it. Official statistics seemed to prove the point. Steel production climbed year after year. Coal output reached astonishing levels. Tractor factories, tank plants, chemical combines, everything appeared massive, expanding, unstoppable. 5-year plans were announced with confidence. Targets were always met, sometimes exceeded. On paper, the Soviet economy looked enormous, but paper was doing far more work than anyone admitted. Behind the grand parades, the rockets, the tanks, and the slogans, something quieter was happening. Something invisible to foreign observers, and even to many inside the system. The Soviet Union was slowly replacing strength with appearance. What made the system look powerful was not efficiency, innovation, or resilience. It was scale. Sheer bulk, the ability to mobilize millions of workers, and enormous quantities of raw materials towards centrally chosen goals. But scale can hide weakness for a long time, especially when no one is allowed to question the numbers. By the late 1970s, cracks were already everywhere. Consumer shelves were thin, housing shortages were chronic, waiting lists stretched for years, basic appliances broke easily, food quality varied wildly by region. Entire industries survived only because failure was politically impossible, but these problems were dismissed as temporary inconveniences, minor flaws in an otherwise superior system. The leadership believed this too. Soviet planners saw themselves as managers of history. They believed that with enough data, enough directives, enough discipline, they could calculate the future itself. Markets were dismissed as chaotic guesswork. Prices were set by decree. Production targets were decided in offices far from the factory floor. And as long as reports looked good, everything was assumed to be good. What almost no one admitted, because admitting it would unravel the entire ideology, was that the Soviet economy was no longer being driven by productivity. It was being held together by something far simpler. Money, not rubles, which had little meaning inside the system, but hard currency, dollars, Western credit, and above all, oil revenue. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it lost a war. It did not collapse because it was invaded. It did not collapse because capitalism outfought it on the battlefield. It collapsed because it mistook temporary income for permanent strength. And when that income disappeared, the illusion collapsed with it. But to understand how a superpower paid for its own destruction, we must first understand the addiction that kept it alive. The Soviet Union's survival in the 1970s had a secret: oil. In 1973, the global energy market changed overnight. The oil shock sent prices soaring. For energy exporters, it was a windfall. For the Soviet Union, sitting atop vast reserves of oil and natural gas, it was a financial miracle. Suddenly, the USSR was earning massive amounts of hard currency. This mattered more than almost anything else. Inside the Soviet system, rubles were accounting units, not real money. They could not buy advanced machinery abroad. They could not pay for grain shipments. They could not purchase Western technology. Only dollars could do that. And now, oil was generating them by the billions. The leadership saw this as validation, proof that socialism worked, proof that the system had outlasted capitalism's crises. Instead of reforming agriculture, industry, or incentives, the Soviet Union did something far easier. It paid for its problems. Soviet agriculture was deeply inefficient. Collective farms lacked incentives. Machinery was outdated. Logistics were chaotic. Weather fluctuations routinely caused shortfalls. Feeding the population required massive imports of grain, often from the very capitalist countries the USSR condemned. Oil money made this possible. Instead of fixing structural failures, the state simply bought food abroad. Instead of modernizing factories properly, it imported select equipment. Instead of confronting waste, it covered losses with export revenue. Oil revenue did not reform the system. It anesthetized it. By the late 1970s, energy exports accounted for a growing share of Soviet foreign earnings. Entire budgets were built on the assumption that oil prices would remain high forever. This assumption was never debated publicly. Questioning it would imply uncertainty, and uncertainty was politically dangerous. As long as oil flowed, the illusion of control held, but dependence has consequences. Oil revenue created a false sense of security. It discouraged innovation. It delayed reform. It allowed inefficiency to become permanent. Ministries grew bloated. Production targets became ceremonial. Everyone learned how to report success regardless of reality. The economy was no longer improving. It was being subsidized by geology. And worse, the leadership didn't just rely on oil. It reorganized the entire system around it. When oil prices rose, inefficiency was invisible. When prices fell, there would be nothing underneath. The Soviet Union had become what it despised most, a commodity exporter vulnerable to global markets it could not control. The addiction was complete. The Soviet economy ran on statistics, but those statistics were designed to protect careers, not truth. In a planned system, success was measured by meeting targets. If a factory was ordered to produce a certain number of tons, units, or kilometers, that number became sacred. Quality did not matter, usefulness did not matter, only fulfillment mattered. This created a culture of distortion. Factories produced heavier goods to meet weight quotas. Equipment was assembled without regard for durability. Warehouses filled with unsellable products that technically counted as success. Entire industries existed to satisfy plans, not people. And because failure was punished, honesty disappeared. Managers inflated numbers to avoid blame. Ministries accepted false reports because challenging them would expose deeper problems. By the time data reached the top, it had been polished into fiction. The leadership believed its own propaganda. GDP figures rose, but productivity stagnated. Output increased, but usefulness declined. The system looked enormous, but it was hollow. Oil money covered this gap. As long as the state could import what it lacked, the internal decay went unnoticed. But lies compound. Each year required more imports. Each year required more oil revenue. Each year reduced flexibility. The Soviet Union was not collapsing yet, but it was becoming brittle. And brittle systems shatter suddenly. The Cold War is usually described as a battle between two completely separate systems. Capitalism versus socialism. East versus West, the dollar versus the ruble. But behind the speeches, the parades, and the ideological threats, the Soviet Union was doing something deeply ironic. It was financing the very system it claimed to be fighting. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union had become one of the world's largest exporters of oil and natural gas. These exports did not circulate inside the socialist bloc. They were sold on global markets. Priced in dollars, paid for through Western banks. This detail mattered more than missiles, because once the Soviet Union accepted dollars, it entered a system it could not control. Those dollars did not sit idle in Moscow vaults. They flowed outward back into the capitalist economies of Europe, North America, and Japan. They paid for grain shipments from the United States and Canada. They paid for industrial machinery from West Germany. They paid for chemical equipment, computers, shipping services, spare parts, and entire factory systems. In other words, the Soviet Union sold raw materials and bought finished goods. This is the classic pattern of economic dependency. And it was happening to a country that claimed to be self-sufficient. Soviet planners knew this was uncomfortable, but they believed it was temporary. The imports were supposed to modernize industry. Western technology would be studied, copied, absorbed, and eventually replaced by domestic production. That was the theory. In reality, the opposite happened. Western imports became permanent. Each year, the USSR needed more grain, not less. More machinery, not less. More spare parts, not fewer. Domestic industry did not catch up. It lagged further behind. Western firms improved rapidly. Soviet factories stagnated. And because oil paid the bills, there was no immediate pressure to change. Even more quietly, Western banks became part of the Soviet system. The USSR began borrowing. Not openly, not dramatically. But steadily, credit lines were extended. Payment delays normalized. Financial dependence crept in without public acknowledgement. This was not colonialism by force, it was dependency by convenience. The Soviet Union was now structurally linked to the capitalist world economy. Its food security depended on Western harvests. Its industrial maintenance depended on Western components. Its budget stability depended on global oil prices set in markets it did not control. And every dollar earned through oil exports strengthened the same global financial system the USSR claimed was doomed. This is the great paradox of the late Cold War. The Soviet Union was not economically isolated, it was economically entangled, and that entanglement was asymmetric. When Western economies slowed, they diversified. When Soviet revenues dropped, there was nowhere else to turn. The USSR had become a supplier at the bottom of the value chain and a buyer at the top. That is not how empires win. That is how they bleed quietly. For more than a decade, oil had masked everything. It hid inefficiency. It hid waste. It hid lies. But in the early 1980s, the global oil market changed. New producers entered the market. Demand slowed. Prices fell sharply, and suddenly the Soviet Union's financial foundation vanished. This was not a slow decline. It was a shock. Export revenues dropped dramatically. Hard currency reserves shrank. Budgets built on high oil prices collapsed almost overnight. The problem was not just less money. The problem was that the entire system assumed there would always be more. Imports that had been routine became unaffordable. Grain shipments were delayed. Machinery orders were cancelled. Spare parts disappeared. Factories slowed or stopped entirely, not because of ideology, but because a single component was missing. Inside the USSR, shortages returned with force. Food lines grew longer. Shelves emptied faster. Regional disparities worsened. Peripheral republics felt the strain first. Moscow could no longer subsidize them as before. The leadership panicked. They searched for solutions that did not require admitting failure. They cut investments. They borrowed more. They postponed reforms again. But this time there was no cushion. Oil had been the oxygen supply. Now the system was suffocating. The planned economy, already rigid, became paralyzed. Without imports, its inefficiencies became lethal. Agricultural failures could no longer be covered with purchases abroad. Industrial defects could no longer be patched with Western technology. Every lie written into the system was now exposed. The Soviet Union was not poor, it was structurally bankrupt. And worse, the political consequences were immediate. When money disappears, loyalty follows. Republics began questioning why they should remain tied to a center that could no longer support them. National movements gained traction not because ideology changed, but because subsidies stopped. The system was unraveling economically before it unraveled politically. This is what made the collapse unstoppable. There was no military solution, no propaganda fix, no emergency decree that could create dollars or raise oil prices. The trap had closed. Empires usually fall loudly, through war, through invasion, through revolution. The Soviet Union fell quietly. There were no foreign tanks in Moscow, no decisive battlefield defeat, no single dramatic moment where the system was overthrown. Instead, there was a series of unpaid bills, factories that could not operate, regions that could not be funded, citizens who could no longer be fed reliably. The central government lost authority not because people stopped believing, but because it stopped delivering. By the late 1980s, the Soviet state could not perform its most basic function, redistribution. It could not move resources efficiently from where they existed to where they were needed. And without that function, the Union made no economic sense. Republics realized this before politicians admitted it. Why stay in a system that no longer pays? Why obey a center that cannot supply? The answer became obvious. The Soviet Union did not dissolve because of freedom speeches. It dissolved because the financial glue holding it together dried up. Oil had built the illusion of permanence. Its absence revealed reality. This is the final irony. The USSR spent decades preparing for war it never fought, while ignoring the economic vulnerabilities that destroyed it. It collapsed not under attack, but under its own operating costs. The system paid itself into exhaustion, and when the bill arrived, there was no one left to cover it.